Welcome, dear listener, to Candlelight Mysteries, where every whisper hides a truth and every shadow conceals a secret. This evening, our tale is Death Over the Garden Wall, a quiet tragedy beneath the roses of St. Mary Mead. The air is still, the lawns trimmed, and the world appears perfectly content. Yet beneath that calm, a seed of unease begins to stir, drawing our attention to a certain ivy-covered boundary between two genteel homes. Miss Marple, ever gentle and observant, sits by her window with her knitting and her thoughts. She listens to the hum of bees and the gossip of sparrows, her eyes thoughtful as ever. Around her, the village prepares for another summer fete, unaware that deceit has already taken root in the soil. This is a story of manners and mischief, of pride and quiet sorrow, all revealed by the calm wisdom of one kind heart that sees too much and speaks too softly. Chapter 1. The Ivy Wall. The C.T. village awoke to a soft blue morning that promised gentle heat. St. Mary Mead looked freshly ironed. Lawns lay flat and pale. Roses lifted damp heads as if pleased to be consulted. At the Grenville Estate, gardeners arranged trestle tables for the fete. Bunting in modest colours fluttered. The hedges were clipped into careful obedience. The ivy wall on the eastern boundary showed its age with authority. Miss Marple came on foot along the lane. She carried a neat shopping bag and a folded cardigan. Her steps were unhurried. She approved of mornings that did not rush anyone. Lady Grenville waited near the orangery, making lists on a card. Her pen moved quickly. She smiled when she saw Miss Marple and touched the brim of her hat with 2 fingers. Miss Marple praised the roses with real satisfaction. She inquired after the tea urn and the raffle baskets. Lady Grenville reported that both were in hand. She spoke briskly, yet seemed a little distracted. Harold Grenville appeared from behind the wall with a coil of rope. He greeted Miss Marple politely and set the rope down. He asked where the additional stalls might go. He did not look at his aunt when he spoke. Mr. Dawes the gardener inspected a row of potted geraniums. He wore clean boots and a light shirt. His hands were browned and speckled with old scratches. He moved like a man measuring everything against a line. A thin man in a tweed coat strolled up the drive. He carried a walking stick that had not touched mud. He looked with interest at the windows and the chimneys. His eyes paused on the ivy wall. Lady Grenville's pen paused. She greeted him with courtesy and asked his business. He admired the house and said he had known the late Lord Grenville long ago. He hoped to present respects during the fete. Miss Marple listened without intruding. She noted that his coat sleeves were a trifle short. She saw a faded ink smudge along the right thumb. The walking stick showed a chip near the ferrule. The stranger complimented the layout of the south lawn. He described the original garden plan with a confidence that sounded homely. He recalled a sundial near the yew. The sundial had been moved years earlier, Lady Grenville answered with practised grace. She said change came to gardens as it did to families. She asked for his name. He supplied a surname that seemed to sit lightly upon him. Miss Marple viewed the ivy wall again. She saw a pale square where ivy had been trimmed back. The mortar there looked newer than its neighbours. Mr. Dawes avoided looking in that direction. A string of village ladies arrived with baskets and tins. They placed cakes on a long table and discussed the raffle. One spoke of the weather. Another mentioned the church roof. Conversation drifted toward property boundaries as if by habit. Miss Marple said the strawberries were excellent this year. She asked whether the eastern plot still received morning sun. Mr. Dawes said the sun had not changed its path. His tone suggested he wished it would. The vicar stopped by to offer blessings for fair weather. He admired the bunting and spoke kindly to the young helpers. When he mentioned the field beyond the wall, Lady Grenville folded her list and changed the subject. Miss Marple felt the small kink of tension that settles beneath polite words. It lay low and firm. She had seen such kinks before. They usually connected money, memory, and pride. She wandered to the tea tent and admired the china. She counted spoons because that is how order begins. She reminded a girl to keep the milk cool. She praised a sponge cake with lemon icing. A gust of breeze stirred the ivy. A tiny shred of old paper fluttered free. It drifted like a moth and caught against a broom handle. Miss Marple pinched it gently and saw a line of neat figures and a date. She asked the girl for a small envelope and placed the scrap inside. She did not call attention. She smiled and thanked the girl for her help. She put the envelope into her shopping bag beside a ball of yarn. Harold returned with the rope and marked out the skittles pitch. He measured distances with exact movements. When he came near the ivy wall, he shortened his stride by 1 pace. He did not seem aware of it. Lady Grenville announced that tea would be served at 4. She reminded the committee about the opening speech. She asked the stranger to sign the guest book. He did so and hesitated over the year. Miss Marple studied the handwriting as one studies a garden bed. She saw the careful loops and an effort to disguise an old habit of flourish. She saw a faint tremor that did not match his firm voice. First clue or observation arrived with the post. A boy brought a brown envelope addressed to Lady Grenville in an old hand. The stamp had been cancelled in London last evening. The corner carried a smudge of green chalk. Lady Grenville tucked the envelope into her reticule. She went very still for a heartbeat, then smiled again. She asked Miss Marple whether she might approve the scone arrangement. Miss Marple approved the rose petals scattered on the tray. The stranger wandered toward the conservatory and peered in at the glass shelves. He admired the cactus blossoms with professional interest. He asked Mr. Dawes about watering. Mr. Dawes said little and pointed to the copper can. Miss Marple watched a small exchange of glances. The stranger looked too long at the far shelf where a ledger used to sit. Mr. Dawes looked at the floor and shuffled a boot. Lady Grenville looked away. Clouds formed in a slow ring above the fields. The day kept its brightness. A faint tension hung like linen not yet dry. People arrived with cheerful voices. The fete opened with polite applause. Miss Marple took a seat near the tea tent. She threaded her knitting needles and made a neat row. She counted softly while observing faces. Counting helps one observe without staring. The stranger stood near the portrait of Lord Grenville displayed under a canopy. He admired the frame and named the painter without prompting. A local woman asked how he knew such things. He said he had good memory for kind hosts. Lady Grenville thanked donors for cakes and jams. She avoided the portrait canopy. She met Miss Marple's eyes once and gave a small nod that said she was quite well. Miss Marple returned a mild nod that said she believed her. Harold sold tickets and avoided conversation longer than necessary. He watched the stranger with narrow calculation. When the stranger came to buy tickets, Harold handed them with a tight smile. The paper crinkled sharply in his hand. Mr. Dawes arranged the geraniums a second time. He shifted one pot twice to the left and once to the right. Then he made no change and seemed better. His eyes flicked toward the ivy wall whenever a shadow crossed it. Miss Marple finished a small square of knitting and folded it. She walked to the edge of the lawn and greeted the vicar. She asked about the church accounts. He said the roof appeal had improved. The tone implied new hope. At the cake stall, Mrs. Hartnell counted coins with authority. She liked money to behave. She told Miss Marple that the eastern field remained a sore point. She believed a new survey would solve it. She loved solutions that involved rulers. Second clue or observation arrived with the raffle drum. Miss Marple noticed a key attached by string to the handle. The metal showed a fresh scrape. The teeth were slightly bent inward, as if forced once against resistance. The stranger drifted back to the conservatory. He stood with his hands behind his back and leaned slightly forward. Lady Grenville saw him and changed direction at once. She offered him lemonade and suggested the hoop toss. He agreed politely. Miss Marple stepped into the conservatory during the lull. She looked at the far shelf with the smooth rectangle of dust. Something had rested there for years. A ledger-shaped absence announced itself with quiet certainty. Rain teased the air and withdrew. The afternoon moved like a clock that had been carefully wound. Children ran between the stalls. A dog barked twice and found it unnecessary to do so again. Miss Marple paused by the ivy wall where the mortar looked newer. She touched a trailing tendril. It lifted away as if recently cut back. Behind the leaves, the stone felt cool and faintly damp. In the orangery, Lady Grenville gave her speech. She thanked the village for loyalty and kindness. She praised the gardeners for devotion. She spoke of her late husband with a balanced voice that neither quavered nor hardened. The stranger listened with polite interest. He stood too straight for comfort. When Lady Grenville said legacy, he blinked slowly. Miss Marple saw his right hand close over the walking stick. The knuckles whitened and then relaxed. Third clue or observation came with the guest book again. A sudden gust flipped a page. Miss Marple held it flat and saw a faint indentation beneath the signatures. Someone had pressed hard while writing and then torn out a sheet. The torn edge was very clean. Harold announced the Skittles prize. A boy rolled the ball with success. Laughter rose and fell. In that small cheer, a different sound occurred. A soft clink near the ivy wall, as if metal touched stone where it should not. Mr. Dawes hurried to adjust a flag. He moved toward the wall and then away. He avoided the place where ivy hid the mortar. He straightened a flag on the far lawn and wiped his hands. Miss Marple returned to her seat and began another row of knitting. She threaded wool with patience. She thought of new mortar and old paper. She thought of the stranger's ink smudge. She thought of a ledger-shaped absence that troubled the air. Evening folded gently over the fate. Lamps were lit along the pathways. The band played a calm tune that did not intrude. Cake dwindled and conversation mellowed. The stranger remained, careful and smiling. Lady Grenville took a tray of sandwiches to the workers. She put one aside and forgot it. She spoke to Miss Marple and asked how she found the arrangements. Miss Marple praised the order and the civility of it all. The stranger asked to see the portrait again. He studied the painted ring on Lord Grenville's hand. He asked if the ring remained in the family. Lady Grenville said it did, and that it was always kept safe. Her voice stayed cool. Fourth clue or observation showed itself under a lamp. Miss Marple noticed a smear of clay on the stranger's shoe. The clay had the greenish cast of the eastern plot. It differed from the dry brown earth of the central lawn. A light rain began. The fete closed with thanks and tidy applause. People collected their umbrellas and drifted toward the lane. Mr. Dawes stacked chairs with steady rhythm. Harold counted leftover tickets and made neat bundles. Lady Grenville withdrew to the house for a moment. She returned with a silk wrap and a calm face. She spoke to the vicar at the gate and thanked him for his presence. He blessed the household with kind gravity. Miss Marple stood at the garden's edge and watched the ivy move in the wet breeze. She thought of walls that outlast men and promises that do not. She thought of names written twice and the peculiar silence that follows. The stranger offered his farewells with careful courtesy. He said he would call again on the morrow. He touched his hat to Lady Grenville and to Miss Marple. He walked away along the lane and did not look back. Mr. Dawes locked the conservatory door and placed the key in his pocket. He wiped the door handle with his handkerchief. He was a neat man who preferred neat ends. The night did not promise such ends. Harold coiled the rope once more. He put it away without hurry. He stood a moment and looked at the ivy wall. Then he looked at the house windows where the lamps burned warm and bright. Miss Marple closed her knitting bag and took up her shopping bag. The small envelope with the paper scrap lay quiet among the yarn. She felt its presence with the ease of long habit. She knew scraps can become maps. She walked home along the lane where puddles reflected small squares of lamplight. She admired the sparing rain and the scent of wet earth. She noted a faint scuff on the lane's edge where someone had stepped off hurriedly. Sleep came late in St. Mary Mead that night. The village dreamed of raffles and jam. In one dream, a wall stood very tall. In another, a ledger opened and a single page drifted loose like a pale leaf. Miss Marple set her bag on a chair and placed the envelope within a book of household hints. She made tea and watched the steam rise. She smiled softly because puzzles are patient friends. She thought of the stranger's careful voice and of Lady Grenville's composed smile. She thought of the gardener's tidy caution. She thought of Harold's unsmiling arithmetic. She saw how they arranged themselves like chessmen around a square of ivy. Morning would bring new certainties and new questions. Gardens do that. They look the same and then they do not. They keep a private diary written in soil and water. Miss Marple folded her cardigan and turned down the lamp. The rain lightened to a hush. In that hush, she heard the quiet click of a distant gate. Someone moved when others slept. She felt no surprise. She sat and watched the window for a minute. A cat crossed the sill outside and paused. The village kept its secrets politely. Yet secrets breathe. They ask to be noticed. She wound her wool and placed it aside. She straightened a teaspoon that had gone a little astray. She smiled again and let the night settle into order. The wall would speak soon enough. Chapter 2. The unexpected guest rain spoke on the shutters through most of the night. By morning, the clouds thinned into a pale muslin sky. St. Mary Mead gathered itself for duty. The fete debris waited to be folded and stored. Lawns glittered with beads of water that refused to decide. Miss Marple reached the Grenville gates as the clock on the church struck 9. She carried a small parcel of seed cakes. Her step was light, but her gaze was thoughtful. She believed in paying calls when minds were likely to be honest. Lady Grenville thanked her at the door and led the way to the morning room. The room smelled of damp roses and beeswax. Tea waited under a cosy stitched with violets. Order was present, though strained at the edges. The stranger from the fete arrived soon after, as promised. He removed his hat with care and bowed his head to Lady Grenville. He asked after her health and praised the village hedges. His voice carried a dry urban polish. Miss Marple greeted him with mild warmth. She offered seed cake. He accepted without appetite. His eyes moved around the room in a slow sweep, respectful, yet restless. They paused briefly at the mantel clock and the glass-fronted bookcase. Mr. Dawes came to the door to inquire about the broken trestle. He stood neatly, hat in hand. When the stranger turned toward him, something cool passed between them. It was there and then gone like a thread drawn through fabric. Harold entered with a ledger of accounts for the fete. He placed it on the table with tidy satisfaction. He thanked Miss Marple for the seed cakes. He thanked the stranger for the compliments offered yesterday. His tone was trimmed and narrow. The conversation turned to the rain. It had saved the roses and hindered the skittles. Lady Grenville spoke of the church roof appeal. The stranger congratulated her on the generous totals. Harold inclined his head like a man balancing columns in air. Miss Marple asked whether the conservatory had leaked. Lady Grenville said it had not. The stranger expressed relief and said the conservatory had always been a proud feature. He looked at the ceiling while saying it, as if listening for a forgotten note. They moved to the conservatory as if that were the natural course. The glass was beaded with last night's memory. Pots stood in orderly ranks, some with saucers, some without. The air smelled of soil, lime, and old potting twine. Lady Grenville admired a cactus flower that had opened during the night. The stranger praised the way the light fell across the bench. Mr. Dawes adjusted a watering can that did not need adjusting. Harold stood by the door, already ready to leave. A square of smooth dust marked the shelf where something had long rested. It said nothing and it said everything. The stranger looked at it with professional abstraction. He did not ask what had been there. He did not need to ask. Miss Marple spoke of geranium cuttings and their fondness for kind fingers. She praised Mr. Dawes for his skill. He nodded, pleased but private. She watched the way his eyes measured distances as if to steady himself. First clue or observation arrived with a small twist of metal. On the floor near the shelf lay a bent paperclip, half straightened, bearing a faint green stain. Miss Marple noted it and remarked that gardeners never trust unruly wires. The stranger admired the conservatory door lock. He said good locks prevented small tragedies. Harold said good accounts did the same. Lady Grenville smiled as if both were agreeable truths. Mr. Dawes said nothing and polished the spout of the watering can. In the drawing-room, the stranger asked permission to see a portrait again. Lady Grenville led him to the canopy where the painting had been sheltered from the fate weather. The canvas leaned against the wall, wrapped in muslin. She lifted the cloth with care. The late Lord Grenville looked out with steady grey eyes. His ring flashed softly where the painter had loved yellow. The stranger stood very still. He placed one hand behind his back as if to control it. Then he nodded in a way that ended something private. Miss Marple studied the frame. She saw tiny grains of grit lodged along the inner edge, as if the painting had been moved quickly in a room with sanded floors. Yet the Grenville floors were polished oak. The detail left a small question hanging. Tea returned with quiet ceremony. The vicar had been invited to join them. He came with a friendly air and a mind for peace. Talk turned to the war years and the village's small heroics. The stranger contributed nothing of himself. He contributed facts. Harold excused himself to handle the fate proceeds. He lifted the ledger with unusual ease and left the room without sound. Lady Grenville watched him go. Her eyes followed the book, not the man. Miss Marple saw that and tucked the knowledge away. Second clue or observation came with the guest book from yesterday. It had been set aside near the mantel for proper tidying. Miss Marple turned a page and noticed a fine shaving of blue pencil in the gutter. It matched the faint marks used by clerks to align signatures. The stranger spoke of Lord Grenville with practised recollection. He mentioned summer evenings in the West Garden. He recalled a habit of pacing while dictating letters. Lady Grenville listened with hands folded. She asked the stranger how long he had served as solicitor. He answered that he had been an assistant in those days. He named a firm on Bedford Row, now dissolved. He said he had come to ensure a matter from the past was quite in order. He did not enlarge upon it. Miss Marple asked very gently whether the matter concerned a document of land or legacy. The stranger smiled and said that everything concerned land and legacy in one way or another. He asked if the vicar agreed. The vicar said people did tend to their acres and their souls. Rain freckles began to stir again across the windows. The light shifted into something thoughtful. Lady Grenville pressed the tea cosy as if to hold warmth in place. The stranger considered the mantel clock with the absorbed air of a man counting. They rose to tour the eastern lawn. The ivy wall showed beads of water along each leaf, a necklace of patience. The mortar's newness stood out against older stone. Miss Marple brushed a leaf aside and admired the original workmanship. Third clue or observation revealed itself at her feet. A narrow groove had been pressed into the soft earth at the base of the wall. It looked like the mark of a wooden box slid carefully and then lifted. The soil remembered what hands tried to hide. Lady Grenville asked the stranger how long he would remain in the village. He said he had taken a room at the inn for a few days. He hoped the matter could be resolved quickly for everyone's comfort. He looked sorry to trouble anyone. Mr. Dawes fetched a basket of tools as if to continue work. He selected a small hand trowel and then returned it. He chose the secateurs instead and clipped a single tendril that offended his sense of line. He worked to the rhythm of restraint. Harold reappeared with the fate funds sealed in a stout envelope. He reported the totals in neat numbers. The vicar beamed. Lady Grenville expressed gratitude. The stranger congratulated them and said order was a comfort to the soul. Miss Marple glanced at Harold's shoes. She noticed a thin rim of grey dust that did not belong to the wet lawn. It suggested an interior floor, perhaps a storeroom, perhaps a place no one had mentioned today. The stranger took his leave, promising to return in the evening with a letter that might clarify the past. He bowed and walked through the gate with that same controlled stride. His hat tilted to the same careful angle as yesterday. Lady Grenville stood by the window after he had gone. She held the envelope of funds. She did not put it down. Miss Marple watched the way her knuckles lifted the silk of her glove. The fabric made a small hill over a private worry. The vicar spoke of trust in Providence. He asked if he might carry the envelope directly to the church safe. Harold agreed at once. Lady Grenville consented with visible relief. Mr. Dawes nodded as if order had reasserted itself. Fourth clue or observation arrived from the mantel clock. It had stopped at 8:40 the previous evening, judging by the hands. Yet someone had wound it this morning, because the key lay askew on the shelf with fresh smears. The contradiction was like a whisper in an empty pew. Miss Marple asked permission to examine the clock for dust. Lady Grenville smiled and said, "Of course." Miss Marple turned it gently and saw a hairline scratch on the back plate. She made no comment. She simply set the clock to the correct time and let it tick. The rain ceased again. Light returned in a gentle sheet. The house breathed a little easier. People dispersed to their duties. The day prepared itself for evening and its decisions. By 6, the village lamps blinked awake. The inn sign creaked and settled. The road shone with a thin polish from the late shower. The stranger arrived at the Grenville door with a small case in his hand. Miss Marple sat in the morning room, as if by chance. She had a basket of mending on her lap. Lady Grenville had given her the privilege of calm company. It was the kind of privilege that matters when storms change shape. The stranger saluted the company and placed the case upon the table. He opened it with a key, then lifted a folder tied with green tape. His hands were steady. His eyes carried a lucid fatigue. He said he had come to present a memorandum and a letter written by the late Lord Grenville. He said the letter concerned an adjustment in certain holdings near the eastern boundary. He said he wished the vicar to be present as a witness to civility. The vicar arrived as the sentence concluded. He carried kindness like a shawl. He took a seat and folded his large hands. Harold stood by the window with his back to the room. Mr. Dawes was not invited, but appeared at the door with a request about a ladder. He was asked to return later. 5th clue or observation waited inside the folder. Miss Marple saw a watermark in the paper that belonged to a stationer on Bedford Row. The mark showed a small corn sheaf and a date. The date was a year later than the letter claimed in its heading. The stranger laid out the letter. Lady Grenville read it with grave attention. The text named a parcel of land to be restored to the adjoining property. It mentioned a prior heir in a deed. It spoke courteously of the need to correct a mistake. Harold asked to see the memorandum. He read quickly. He asked about the delay in raising the matter. The stranger said the file had been lost during an office removal. He said he had discovered it while ordering a dissolution inventory. Miss Marple asked whether the original ledger from the Grenville Conservatory might have been used to confirm measurements. The stranger agreed that the ledger would be helpful. Lady Grenville stated that the ledger had been destroyed years ago for reasons of tidiness. The room waited on that sentence. The air thinned and sharpened. The vicar looked at his hands. Harold closed the memorandum and opened it again. The stranger inclined his head, as if deciding where to place a delicate foot. 6th clue or observation arrived with sound. From the hallway came the discreet click of a latch that sticks unless coaxed. Miss Marple knew the latch. It belonged to the small cupboard where household tools were kept. She had noticed the scratch near the keyhole in the morning. Mr. Dawes entered after a knock and asked for Lady Grenville's decision on the ladder. His eyes did not visit the table. His hands were too clean for a man who had just handled rungs. He left as quietly as he came, yet the air kept the outline of his absence. The stranger resumed. He said he would not trouble the family if the matter caused distress. He said his duty was to present the documents and request cooperation. He said he would call upon the adjoining owner in the morning. Lady Grenville stood very straight. She thanked him for his propriety. She asked whether the letter spoke of intent or command. He said it spoke of intent reinforced by conscience. She nodded once. The gesture contained both pride and fatigue. Miss Marple asked to see the envelope that had arrived yesterday. Lady Grenville brought it from her writing desk. The stamp carried that green chalk smear. Inside lay a brief note with a London postmark. It requested a private conversation about matters affecting the estate. 7th clue or observation lived in the envelope's flap. There was a tiny notch where a letter opener had slipped, then corrected. The gum had been resealed with a different paste. Miss Marple touched it and smelled a faint almond sweetness. Household paste at Grenville House always smelled of mint. Harold spoke with tightly folded calm. He said that any adjustment to the boundary would ruin a planned improvement. He said a pergola and a new walk were already estimated. He said the village had expected a better view for the fete next year. The vicar said that conscience often asks for something that inconveniences plans. He suggested patience and careful reading. The stranger thanked him. Miss Marple knitted one firm stitch and asked whether the will had ever mentioned the Eastern plot. Lady Grenville answered that the will referred to holdings collectively. She added that her husband had wished to keep the village comfortable. She looked toward the ivy wall through the darkened window. She seemed to listen to the rain that had already stopped. 8th clue or observation arrived when the mantel clock chimed. It did not chime the proper hour. It chimed once and then twice again after a pause. Someone had reset it recently and imperfectly. Miss Marple lifted her eyes and registered the small discord. The stranger proposed that he and Lady Grenville examine the ground with a surveyor tomorrow. He offered to secure one from market basing. Harold objected and said the village surveyor would suffice. Lady Grenville agreed to Harold's suggestion with a cool thank you. A knock came at the outer door. Mrs. Hartnell entered, brisk with village authority. She brought the fate's remaining coins that had been miscounted. She apologized for the error and placed a small purse on the table. The purse had a broken clasp. 9th clue, or observation, rested in that purse. A grain of freshly chipped mortar nestled near the clasp's hinge. It glittered faintly under the lamp. Mrs. Hartnell laughed and said she must have leaned against the wall while gossiping. She never noticed where she leaned. The stranger rose to leave. He said he would return at 10 tomorrow. He placed the folder back into the case and locked it. Lady Grenville escorted him to the door. The vicar murmured a prayer for clarity. Harold remained at the window, a figure cut from arithmetic. Miss Marple asked for a short walk in the garden before she departed. Lady Grenville joined her. The evening smelled of damp stone and roses. A single snail described a silver thread along a paving stone. The air was quiet and undecided. They paused by the ivy wall. Lady Grenville touched a leaf and then her throat. She said that gardens make good cover for mistakes and kindness alike. Miss Marple agreed. She said that gardens remember even when people cannot afford to remember. 10th clue, or observation, lay just above knee height. A leaf had been pinned back with a tiny brass tack. It was the sort used to fix rugs. The tack was new and bright. Behind the leaf, a hairline seam in the mortar suggested a shallow recess. Miss Marple kept her voice low. She said that walls sometimes develop useful hollows. Lady Grenville said some hollows were made on purpose. She took a breath, then released it with care. She asked whether Miss Marple believed the stranger trustworthy. Miss Marple said the stranger believed himself honest. She added that people can be honest for many reasons. She watched a moth hover near the lamp. She watched it decide against the light and return to the dark hedge. Harold stepped onto the terrace. He asked if further conversation was required. Lady Grenville said no. He said he would place the fete proceeds in the church safe with the vicar. He lifted his hat and left by the side gate with quick steps. 11th clue or observation presented itself as Harold crossed the gravel. His heel clicked on metal with a thin ring. Miss Marple followed the sound and looked more closely at the base of the sundial. A small key lay partly buried in grit. Its teeth were bent inward. Lady Grenville picked up the key. She held it to the light. She said it belonged to the old ledger cabinet. She believed it had been missing for years. She looked at Miss Marple without surprise, as if such returns were owed. They re-entered the morning room. The clock had settled into even ticking again. The case with the documents had gone with the stranger. The house felt larger, emptier, and more honest, the kind of honesty that takes away something warm and replaces it with air. Miss Marple asked to place the key somewhere safe. Lady Grenville opened a drawer in her writing desk. She laid the key on a handkerchief and closed the drawer gently. Her hand lingered on the wood, as if listening for an answer. 12th clue or observation echoed from that drawer. A faint scent of ink rose where there should have been lavender. Not fresh ink, but recently woken ink from sealed pages. Miss Marple thought of the paper scrap from the fete resting in her own book at home. The vicar returned from the church and announced the funds secured. He thanked Lady Grenville for trust. He thanked Miss Marple for counsel. He spoke to the wall as if it were a parishioner who needed forgiveness but not fame. They shared a brief supper of bread, soup, and a neat cheese. Conversation avoided the eastern field by habit. Silence did the rest. Dishes clinked softly, each sound staying close to its source. Night gathered with steady hands. The house put away its expressions. Miss Marple rose and tied her scarf. She said she would visit the village shop early tomorrow. She said she had a fancy for new lamp oil. Lady Grenville thanked her for presence and calm. She accompanied Miss Marple to the door. They paused on the step and considered the lawn. It lay like a folded letter, waiting to be opened with care. On the lane, Miss Marple walked without hurry. She reviewed the day as if passing a recipe. One measure of pride, one measure of duty, a pinch of fear, a steady heat from old love. She felt the mixture begin to rise. 13th clue or observation waited under the hedgerow where the lane turned. A fragment of green tape lay caught in the twigs, the same shade as the stranger's folder tie. It carried a cut edge as clean as a blade. Someone had handled the folder outside the house. She picked it up and weighed it on her palm. It was light and certain. She placed it in her bag with the paper scrap. She walked on, counting her steps because counting steadies thought that wants to run. At home, she set the kettle and opened her book of household hints. She took out the fate scrap and placed it beside the green tape. Numbers on the scrap matched a familiar style of estate entries. The date whispered of a correction, not a gift. She wrote a neat list on a plain card. She placed it under the sugar bowl. She wound her clock and listened to its agreement. She drew the curtains with a small, firm tug. Then she sat by the window and let the night arrange itself. An owl asked a quiet question and received quiet wisdom. The lane offered no footsteps. Somewhere far off, a gate decided on a different position. Miss Marple finished her tea and smiled once. She did not smile at victory. She smiled at the feeling of threads gathering in her hands. Threads do that when a patient mind gives them room. Chapter 3. A Shadow in the Conservatory. The morning carried a thin mist that softened every outline. The air smelled of damp earth and overripe pears. St. Mary Mead began its day with subdued cheer. A milk cart rattled past the vicarage. Somewhere, a gate closed with a gentle finality. Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting a row and thinking of ink and mortar. She had written 3 letters before breakfast, 2 to friends, 1 to herself. Writing steadies the mind when questions start to gather like leaves in a drain. At the Grenville Estate, the house had woken early. Servants moved quietly through the corridors. Curtains were drawn back with care. In the conservatory, a faint trail of wet soil led from the door to the inner bench. Mrs. Dawes, the housekeeper, discovered it first. She had come to polish the silver on the glass shelves. She stopped at the dark footprints and frowned. The lock was unbroken, yet the air inside the room felt disturbed. She sent a boy to fetch the gardener. Mr. Dawes came with his keys and a face of polite confusion. He said the door had been bolted when he left it. He said no pot was out of place. But when he bent to look, he found a faint scuff near the empty space where the ledger had once been kept. Lady Grenville appeared soon after. She wore a pale morning gown and held her wrap tight at the throat. She ordered the footprints wiped at once. Then she changed her mind and asked that they remain until the inspector arrived. The vicar, who had come to discuss the church accounts, sent for Inspector Cray at once. The man was a fixture in county inquiries, tall and trim, with a gift for measured suspicion. Miss Marple heard of the trouble from the butcher's boy at her gate. She thanked him with a kind word and set out for the Grenville house, her steps steady and sure. When she arrived, the inspector was already there, examining the door's brass handle. He nodded politely to her, knowing her reputation as the village's quiet observer. He said he was collecting impressions before they disappeared under mops and nerves. Lady Grenville told him that nothing appeared stolen. She said she had checked the silver and the drawers. Yet her eyes moved again and again toward the space on the shelf. The air there seemed thinner than elsewhere. The inspector crouched to inspect the footprints. He said the shoes were small and narrow, likely belonging to a man. The soil was from the eastern garden, not the central beds. He said someone had entered from the lawn through the side path. Miss Marple moved near the window where the condensation had been disturbed. She touched the glass gently and noted how one pane had been wiped from inside. She said that the person who stood there had wanted to see the wall rather than escape through it. First clue or observation rested in a corner of the sill. A tiny flake of green wax clung to the wood. It was the colour of sealing wax used on the letter delivered 2 days before. Miss Marple took out her handkerchief and folded the flake within. Inspector Cray asked whether the gardener had keys. Mr. Dawes admitted he kept one. He said the conservatory door had always needed 2 turns to close properly. He said he had locked it after the fete and had checked it twice. Miss Marple asked what time the storm had reached its height. Mrs. Dawes said it had thundered between midnight and 1. The inspector nodded. He said storms make good company for trespassers who dislike being heard. Lady Grenville's composure remained exact. She offered tea to everyone and set her cup down without clatter. She said nothing about the missing ledger. She said she believed the intruder had mistaken the door. Miss Marple looked toward the shelf again. A thin line of pale dust ran beneath the empty space. The outline of the ledger's base remained, but beside it was the fresh mark of something smaller and square. She thought of a box, perhaps the kind that guards documents from curious eyes. Second clue or observation appeared when she noticed a damp leaf pressed under a flower pot. The leaf bore a perfect square impression, as if a folded paper had rested on it overnight. The stem's bruise suggested gentle pressure, not haste. Inspector Cray questioned the servants in turn. None had seen movement after 10 o'clock. Harold had returned from the church, safe at 9, and gone to bed early. The vicar confirmed their meeting. Mr. Dawes said he had heard only the storm. Miss Marple sat with her knitting beside the door. She asked whether the stranger had been seen since yesterday. Lady Grenville said he had sent a note saying he would arrive late in the morning. She said she expected him before noon. The inspector looked doubtful. He asked whether the note was preserved. Lady Grenville said she had burned it after reading. Miss Marple raised her eyes and met the inspector's. She thought of the green wax and said nothing. Third clue or observation arrived when the vicar noticed a smudge near the floor. The mark resembled the edge of a boot heel, curved slightly inward. Inspector Cray measured it and nodded. The heel was narrow, perhaps from London. Rain began again, soft and private. The conservatory windows trembled with it. Lady Grenville drew the curtains and said she disliked weather that interfered with thinking. Miss Marple smiled faintly and said rain only reveals where the leaks are. At 11, the butler entered with news. A man's walking stick had been found by the gate. The ferrule was freshly chipped. Lady Grenville said it must belong to the stranger. The inspector ordered it brought inside. The stick lay across the table like a challenge. Miss Marple looked at the ferrule and saw a trace of white grit that was not gravel. It matched the dust of mortar from the wall. Fourth clue or observation followed closely. A folded note lay wedged beneath the stick's handle. It bore no address, only a single word. Tonight, the ink had blurred slightly as if written in haste or fear. Inspector Cray studied it, then pocketed it carefully. He said the message might have been intended for someone in the house. Miss Marple asked whether the writing resembled the stranger's hand. The inspector said perhaps, though the pressure seemed firmer. Lady Grenville excused herself to rest. The inspector asked Miss Marple to stay for a word. He said she often noticed what others wished unseen. She said she noticed nothing remarkable, only that gardens dislike being rearranged by strangers. He smiled without humour. He said he would post a man near the lane that night. He said the storm had wiped away tracks, but storms return favours to those who wait. The afternoon darkened earlier than expected. Clouds gathered like folded linen. Miss Marple took tea with Mrs. Dawes in the kitchen. The housekeeper spoke of her husband's quiet nature and of Lady Grenville's sudden illness after the fete. She said the lady had sat awake until dawn. Miss Marple asked whether the mistress had mentioned the stranger by name. Mrs. Dawes said she had called him Mr. Colby. She said the name had startled the gardener for reasons. She did not know fifth clue or observation came when Mrs. Dawes mentioned that her husband had been seen near the conservatory after midnight. He had said he was checking the drain. The storm had been fierce, yet his boots were clean the next morning. At 4, the stranger returned. His coat was soaked, his face drawn. He asked for Lady Grenville at once. The inspector greeted him with professional calm and questioned him about the walking stick. The man looked startled. He said he had lost it near the lane during the storm. Miss Marple observed his gloves. They were new and smelled faintly of camphor, yet one button was missing. The missing button appeared an hour later under the conservatory table, caught in the seam of a rug. Sixth clue or observation, the button shone faintly in the lamplight. Miss Marple turned it in her hand. It was stamped with the letters BR, the same mark she had seen once on Bedford Row. Inspector Cray asked where the stranger had spent the previous night. He said he had slept at the inn. The innkeeper confirmed his presence until 11. After that, no one had seen him. The inspector nodded and wrote something in his notebook. Lady Grenville entered, pale but composed. She thanked the stranger for his diligence. She said the matter could be discussed quietly later. He bowed and said he regretted the disturbance. He asked if she had received his note. She hesitated and said no. The inspector's eyes lifted at that. Miss Marple resumed her knitting with unhurried rhythm. She said she found that missing letters usually travel to places they are least wanted. Evening drew itself around the house like a shawl. The servants finished their duties early. The vicar came again, bringing comfort and prayer. The conversation stayed polite but thin. Seventh clue or observation came with the vicar's umbrella. He had left it near the hall wall. When he took it up to leave, its tip bore a spot of clay, not from the gravel path, but from the garden near the ivy wall. Miss Marple noticed and asked whether he had crossed the lawn. He said no, but that he had walked past the wall while the bell was tolling 6. He thought he had seen a shape moving near the conservatory, though the light was uncertain. Inspector Cray stepped outside with a lantern. Miss Marple followed. The air was cool and smelled of wet stone. Near the conservatory, the soil was pressed flat in a pattern of half-moons. A lantern could not have made such marks. The inspector said they were made by the heel of someone who had stood still too long. Eighth clue or observation waited by the door hinge. A sliver of paper caught beneath the frame. Miss Marple teased it free. It showed a corner of ledger paper with a column of numbers and one word, boundary. She passed it to the inspector, who held it to the light. He said it might be from the missing ledger. Miss Marple nodded and said, "The garden seems to remember even when people forget." They re-entered the house. The stranger had gone, escorted politely by the vicar. Lady Grenville had retired again. The hall clock struck 8 with hollow precision. Miss Marple asked the inspector whether he believed the stranger guilty. He said he believed everyone a little guilty until proven kind. She said kindness often hides better than guilt. Ninth clue or observation appeared when the inspector opened his notebook to review notes. Between 2 pages lay a pressed ivy leaf. He looked puzzled. He had not placed it there. Miss Marple looked at it and said quietly that someone wished to remind him where the truth still grew. Rain began once more, soft and endless. Miss Marple prepared to leave. She thanked the inspector for his courtesy and said she would return in the morning with a thought that needed walking. She crossed the garden path, her umbrella steady above her. At the wall she paused. The ivy glistened. A single tendril had been cut clean and left hanging. The scent of fresh mortar drifted faintly on the air. 10th clue or observation, the scent, told her that someone had opened and resealed a small place in the wall very recently. She knew the smell of lime better than most. She turned toward the gate. Behind her, the conservatory light flickered once and then steadied. She felt eyes on her back but did not turn. She trusted shadows to confess in their own time. At home, she placed the wax flake, the button, and the scrap of ledger paper in a shallow dish. She labelled each with neat care. She wrote on a card, "Motive begins where ownership ends." Then she closed the card inside her knitting book. The night deepened. The air cooled. In another hour, the first owl began to call again. The village settled into its modest dreams. Miss Marple looked out her window and saw the faint outline of the Grenville house across the fields. A light moved once near the ivy wall and vanished. She nodded slowly, as if a question had just answered itself. Chapter 4. Tea in the rain. Rain returned with a steady hand and settled upon the house. The sky held a clean grey that softened corners and quieted nerves. Gardens accepted the blessing and kept their secrets. Lady Grenville rang for tea in the drawing-room. The room answered with polished tables and bowls of roses. Firelight licked gently across the silver. It was an afternoon for manners. Miss Marple arrived a few minutes early. She carried a shawl and a small jar of quince jelly. Her expression was mild, but her eyes kept their useful clarity. Mrs. Hartnell entered with village purpose. She loved accounts and tidy answers. She removed damp gloves and approved the hearth. She noticed every cushion and decided each was placed correctly. Reverend Clement stepped in with a pleasant nod. His umbrella dripped into the copper tray. His coat steamed lightly and smelled of rain and old books. Inspector Cray accepted the invitation as well. He stood a little apart, attentive and civil. He minded his boots and kept his questions folded. Harold came last and looked thinner than yesterday. He thanked his aunt for tea. He glanced toward the window where the ivy wall could not be seen. Cups were poured. Sandwiches waited on the tiered stand. The storm gave the china a musical clarity. Conversation began with polite weather and moved toward village errands. Miss Marple praised the bread and butter. She complimented the cut. She asked if the kitchen had found the right knife at last. Mrs. Dawes said yes with a careful voice. The stranger did not appear. A chair had been placed for him. It remained empty and seemed to listen. Lady Grenville observed the emptiness and said nothing. Mr. Dawes entered with a coal scuttle and a respectful bow. He placed 2 small logs upon the fire and left. His boots were clean again, perhaps too clean for weather like this. Miss Marple watched the steam drift from the teapot. She observed how Lady Grenville's hand steadied when discussing parish work. It trembled only at mentions of ledgers and boundaries. First clue or observation came in a saucer. A pale crumb of green wax clung to the underside. The colour matched the flake found in the conservatory this morning. Miss Marple returned the saucer to its plate. Mrs. Hartnell spoke briskly of the fate accounts. She had balanced them twice. She praised Harold for his precise tallies. She said a village prospers when sums behave. Harold thanked her and looked relieved. He said the totals would please the roof committee. He added that next year's fete would benefit from a clearer lawn view. Reverend Clement mentioned a conversation with the innkeeper. The stranger, Mr. Colby, had eaten little at breakfast. He had looked thoughtful and worn. He had asked for strong tea. Inspector Cray received his cup and listened. He asked whether the innkeeper had noticed anything else. The Reverend said no, only that Mr. Colby kept to himself. The rain rose and softened again. A branch tapped once against the window and rested. The room felt smaller in a comforting way, like a familiar coat. Lady Grenville invited opinions on lace for the altar cloth. Mrs. Hartnell experienced delight. She believed lace could cure tempers. She asked Miss Marple to examine the samples. Miss Marple held the bobbin lace in careful fingers. She admired the pattern of hearts and crosses. She said beauty lives easily beside truth, though truth prefers plainness. Second clue or observation lay in the lace envelope. A thin dusting of grit hid in the corner. Not household dust. Fresh mortar grit with a chalky brightness. Miss Marple folded the envelope closed. Mr. Dawes returned with a tray of hot water. His cuff showed a faint green mark, like bruised ivy. He set the tray down gently and withdrew without glance or word. Harold spoke of a pergola and a gravel walk. He had drawn a plan with measurements. He wished to begin after harvest. He spoke with pride, disguised as practicality. Lady Grenville nodded and smiled, then looked at the rain. Her eyes softened, as if remembering a different garden that once obeyed a different will. She lifted her cup and set it down very carefully. Inspector Cray inquired about last night. He asked whether anyone had heard movement after 10. Mrs. Dawes said the storm crowded out other sounds. The Reverend agreed with a thoughtful frown. Miss Marple asked if the conservatory key had been found. Lady Grenville answered that an old key had reappeared. She did not say from where. She touched her pocket and then folded her hands. Third clue or observation slipped from the hearthrug. A tiny brass tack glinted in the firelight. The tack resembled the one pinning ivy. It had a bright, unscuffed head. Mrs. Hartnell praised the seed cake and requested the recipe. Miss Marple promised a copy. She explained the importance of beating eggs in consistent circles. Order makes light work. The conversation turned, gently and naturally, toward the late Lord Grenville. The Reverend recalled a sermon he had admired. Lady Grenville's mouth tightened and relaxed. She agreed he had been a man of firm views. Inspector Cray asked about the night of his passing. He kept his tone respectful. He said understanding the past sometimes clarifies the present. Lady Grenville looked at the fire rather than the faces. She said the night had been peaceful and private. She said the doctor had arrived in time to offer comfort. She said her husband had spoken of the East Garden before he slept. Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Dawes make a small movement. Not quite a flinch, not quite a nod. The housekeeper poured fresh tea with a hand that asked to be steady. Fourth clue or observation arrived in a teaspoon. Its bowl was slightly abraded as if stirred against something gritty. The other spoons were smooth. This one had met grit recently. Thunder walked far away behind the trees. The rain kept to its work with humble constancy. The ivy outside seemed to breathe with the house. The stranger arrived an hour late, pale and damp. He apologized to the company and accepted tea. His hands shook once, then settled. He asked for lemon rather than milk. Lady Grenville greeted him with reserve. She offered seed cake. He refused with sincere regret. He asked whether a private word might be granted later. She said perhaps if the inspector approved. Inspector Cray took the straight chair and adjusted it slightly. He asked the stranger about the walking stick found near the gate. Mr. Colby admitted losing it, but could not say when. His voice kept its city calm. Miss Marple observed his cuffs. They were clean, but one button had been re-sewn in haste. The thread colour did not match exactly. She wondered where the other thread lived. Fifth clue or observation peeped from his coat pocket. A sliver of green tape clung to the lining. It matched the fragment Miss Marple found by the hedgerow last night. Mrs. Hartnell asked if London firms still preferred heavy stationery. The stranger agreed with pleasure at a safe subject. He praised a stationer on Bedford Row. He did not notice the quick glance that passed between Harold and Lady Grenville. Harold spoke of the memorandum again. He suggested that village surveyors knew village earth best. The stranger bowed and said competence lives in many places. He had invited no argument, yet received one anyway. The Reverend redirected the talk to charity parcels. He asked whether contributions could be arranged before Michaelmas. Lady Grenville promised they could. Her hand eased on the teacup handle. Miss Marple asked, very softly, whether the ledger had ever contained sketches. The stranger said yes, small plans drawn in pencil. Harold looked toward the window and counted something invisible. Sixth clue or observation arrived with the post. A maid brought a single letter for Lady Grenville. The envelope carried a London mark and a faint almond scent. The paste was not mint. Lady Grenville opened it and read without colour in her face. She folded it and placed it beneath the silver tongs. She said it concerned a charitable subscription. Her voice floated, then settled. Inspector Cray asked to see it. She declined with a tired smile. She said it was personal. He accepted the refusal, but logged it carefully in his silence. The stranger asked permission to show a copy of the letter from the late Lord Grenville. He opened his case and brought forth the document tied with green tape. He untied it with slow fingers that feared tearing history. Miss Marple leaned a little nearer and watched the tape's frayed end. It had been cut sharply and then worried by a fingernail. The knot had been redone by a left hand, not a right. Seventh clue or observation flashed in the document's watermark. The year did not match the letter's heading by 12 months. Paper often tells the truth that ink cannot bear. Harold requested the document for a moment. He read quickly, then slower. He said the language expressed intent, not instruction. He asked if the firm possessed any registered amendment. The stranger said no. Mrs. Hartnell declared that honesty required action. She loved sentences that ended with totals and signatures. She had a genius for conclusions that made drawers shut cleanly. The Reverend offered prayer for clarity. He asked that pride produce good fruit rather than thorn. He looked kindly at Lady Grenville as if kindness were a key. Mr. Dawes entered again to ask about a gutter. He stood at the door and waited. His eyes touched nothing and everything. Lady Grenville dismissed him with thanks. He left like a shadow that understood daylight. Eighth clue or observation remained on the carpet where he stood. A faint, damp print of a boot sole showed a notch near the heel. The same notch had marked the conservatory yesterday. The rain grew lighter and began to fail. The house shifted almost imperceptibly as pressure changed. The ivy outside relaxed against the stone like a tired friend. Miss Marple asked the stranger if he had known Lord Grenville's ring. He said yes, a heavy piece set with a pale stone. He remembered a small scratch near the band. He remembered more than comfort allowed. Lady Grenville's hand touched her collarbone. Her eyes grew distant. She asked the inspector whether new statements were necessary. He said they might become so and soon. Ninth clue or observation lay in the ash on the hearth, a half-charred sliver of thick paper edged with green. Not ordinary note stock, possibly ledger board. The smell was sweet, as if paste had burned. Miss Marple asked for the ashpan. She lifted the blackened fragment onto a plate. She studied the faint ruled lines that survived. She saw the word boundary drift through the char like a ghost. Harold said the topic had taken enough of the afternoon. He suggested the stranger return tomorrow with the surveyor. He spoke sharply and then apologized. Pride showed its threadbare place. Lady Grenville agreed. She stood with sudden resolve. She thanked everyone for braving the rain. She said her head ached and the house needed quiet. She asked them to finish their tea. The stranger collected his case with care. He looked at Miss Marple as if asking for something unsaid. She regarded him gently and said that truth prefers to walk, not run. The Reverend led a short prayer and included the stranger by name. His voice found a stillness in the room and left it there. He closed his eyes and let charity do the work. Inspector Cray asked Miss Marple to remain a moment. He examined the hearth fragment once more. He said someone had tried to remove a piece of time and failed. 10th clue or observation came from the window. Raindrops on the pane showed a smear from a finger. The line traced a small square as if framing a hiding place in imagination or memory. Guests departed with polite thanks. Coats were collected and umbrellas reclaimed. The house sighed as doors closed and footmen vanished. The silence inside was larger than the silence outside. Miss Marple lingered near the fire and waited for the room to breathe. Lady Grenville stood at the mantel as if studying flame. Her eyes said tiredness. Her shoulders said duty. Miss Marple asked for the lace envelope again. Lady Grenville passed it without comment. Miss Marple tapped out the grit onto a plate. She smiled sadly and said that gardens speak in every room. Harold returned to say the vicar had gone safely. He paused when he saw the plate. His mouth opened and closed. He said nothing. He left with the door almost closed. 11th clue or observation came from that nearly closed door. A draught stirred the fire and turned the blackened fragment over. A corner flared briefly and revealed a penciled initial before dying. The initial looked like a simple H. Lady Grenville sat down at last. She asked Miss Marple if peace ever returns once disturbed. Miss Marple said peace returns, but it prefers a cleaner house. Inspector Cray approached the mantel clock and set it to the hour. He watched the pendulum find its rhythm. He said rhythm keeps people honest when promises cannot. Miss Marple rose and wrapped her shawl. She thanked Lady Grenville for tea. She praised the seed cake again because small sweetness strengthens courage. She said she would walk by the ivy before going. They stood together at the window for a last moment. Rain loosened into mist. The outline of the wall appeared like a sentence ready to be read. The garden looked composed and watchful. 12th clue or observation waited in the fading light. A sparrow hopped along the coping and pecked at a pale thread. The thread came free and fell. It was green tape, sun faded at one edge. Miss Marple tucked the thread into her glove. She said the past has a habit of untying its own packages. Lady Grenville managed a small smile and said she would try to be brave. The inspector opened the door for Miss Marple and bowed. He asked quietly whether she believed the stranger meant harm. She said he meant correction, which can hurt when pride holds the pen. Outside, the gravel smelled clean and forgiving. The rain had polished every leaf. The lane led away with simple honesty and no promises. Miss Marple walked slowly, counting the beats of the mantel clock in her mind. She thought of grit in a lace envelope and wax on a saucer. She thought of a hearth where paste had burned. She reached the gate and paused. A single drop fell from the yew and landed on her sleeve. She looked back at the house and felt its patience. Houses wait for people to tell the truth. She turned toward the village with quiet resolve. Her shawl held the day's small proofs. Her mind held the slow, certain shape of motive. Ownership had begun it. Fear was shepherding it along. Chapter 5. The body by the wall. Morning arrived with thin sunlight and the hush that follows long rain. The lawns shone wet and obedient, trimmed as if to disguise the night's disorder. The air smelled of ivy and cold earth. Mr. Dawes came to the eastern wall early, carrying his tools and a small hope for quiet work. He knelt to inspect the mortar near the lower stones. His trowel clicked once, then stopped. The earth before him was not smooth. It had a shape that did not belong to the garden. He straightened slowly, his hand shaking in the morning chill. What he had thought a pile of fallen ivy was not ivy. Beneath the leaves lay the sleeve of a coat, dark and wet. He called out for the butler, but his voice sounded hollow. The butler came running. One look was enough. He turned pale and went to fetch Lady Grenville. Miss Marple was already on her way to the estate. She had promised to bring lace samples from Mrs. Hartnell. She met the butler on the path. His face told her more than words could. She followed him without question to the ivy wall. The gardener stood aside, hat in hand. The body lay half concealed by leaves, the face turned toward the soil. The coat was the same tweed the stranger had worn. Lady Grenville arrived moments later. She clutched the wall as though it might steady her. She did not cry out. Her voice, when it came, was measured and low. She asked Miss Marple to stand near her. Inspector Cray was sent for. He arrived with firm steps and a notebook already open. He spoke gently to the gardener and then to Lady Grenville. He asked no questions yet. He simply looked. The man had died recently. The rain had not yet washed the colour from his skin. His right hand was open, palm upward, fingers curled slightly as if they had been holding something delicate. Miss Marple noticed a mark on his wrist where a watch had once rested. The skin there was pale, the edge clean. She thought of how habits leave their own maps upon the body. First clue or observation came from the pocket. The inspector turned it out carefully. There was nothing but a piece of damp paper, blank except for one faint line drawn in pencil, like a boundary. Lady Grenville closed her eyes for a moment. She whispered that his name had been Colby. She said he had come to correct a mistake. The inspector nodded, and his pencil did not move. The gardener crossed himself quietly. He said he had found the man lying as if asleep, his head resting against the wall. He said the ivy had fallen over him as if to hide him. Miss Marple looked closer at the ground beneath the body. The soil was dark with rain, and something darker still. But she noticed the soles of his shoes were clean, as if he had been carried here after death, not fallen. Second clue or observation appeared beside the left shoe, a small fragment of paper folded tight. The inspector lifted it with tweezers. Inside was a single pressed ivy leaf. Nothing more. Lady Grenville drew her shawl around her shoulders. She said quietly that the stranger had asked for a meeting last night. She had declined. She had heard nothing further. Miss Marple stood still, her eyes tracing the line of the wall. The mortar near the base showed a lighter shade in one patch. It looked as if someone had pressed a box or object into the space and sealed it again before dawn. The inspector called for the constable and the doctor. Miss Marple did not move. She watched the ivy stir in a breath of wind and thought of patience, the kind that grows by inches over years. The doctor arrived and confirmed the obvious. The blow to the head had been quick and sure. Death had come before the body met the earth. Lady Grenville whispered something the wind carried away. The inspector said no robbery had occurred, since there was nothing to rob. He ordered the area roped off and the path cleared. Third clue, or observation, came from the gardener's spade. The handle bore a recent chip near the ferrule. The inspector looked at it, then at the man's pale face. Mr. Dawes said the chip had appeared last week, when he mended the flower beds. His voice was steady but dry. Miss Marple bent near the ivy and touched the leaves. They were damp, but beneath them she found dry stems. She noted that they had been cut neatly, not torn. She said nothing, but her eyes told the inspector what he already suspected. The constable brought a small tin found a few yards away. Inside were 2 half-burned matches and a scrap of wax. The inspector examined them without comment. Miss Marple's hands rested quietly on her handbag. Fourth clue or observation appeared when the body was lifted. Beneath it lay a smear of white grit, the same mortar dust Miss Marple had seen on the stranger's shoes 2 days ago. She saw how the circle closed upon itself. Lady Grenville stepped forward once, then stopped. She asked if the man had suffered. The doctor said no. She nodded, as if that word carried the entire burden of mercy. The inspector turned to Miss Marple. He said softly that this was no thief and no accident. She replied that she had been thinking the same thing. The gardener stood apart now, hat against his chest. His eyes stayed fixed on the ivy, not the body. His face was grey as stone. Miss Marple said gently that ivy grows where roots can find cracks. She looked at him, and he did not look back. The inspector told the constable to fetch the vicar. Death required its prayers. The house had become a shrine to silence. Curtains were half drawn. The air smelled of rain and tea. Servants moved softly, as if afraid of breaking the air itself. Miss Marple remained in the morning room with Inspector Cray. A map of the estate lay open on the table. The eastern boundary line glared like a scar. He said the man had come to right an old wrong. He said someone had feared what that meant. She nodded. She said fear often begins as care and ends as cruelty. Fifth clue or observation came from the doctor's report. The blow had been struck with a blunt edge, not sharp. The height of the strike suggested someone of moderate stature. Mr. Dawes matched that measure. Lady Grenville joined them quietly. She said she would cooperate with all inquiries. Her voice carried exhaustion but also command. The inspector thanked her with courtesy. She said her nephew Harold was unwell and had taken to his room. She asked that he be spared questioning until morning. Miss Marple said rest sometimes reveals truth better than argument. The inspector agreed, though his pencil made a single mark beside Harold's name. Sixth clue or observation arrived with Mrs. Dawes. She brought tea for the visitors. Her hands trembled, and one cup spilled slightly. Miss Marple helped her steady it. On her wrist, faint green dust marked where she had brushed against ivy. Mrs. Dawes said her husband had gone out before dawn to check the drains again. He had returned pale and silent. She said he had not eaten. She said he had prayed. Lady Grenville turned away and stood by the window. She pressed her hand against the glass and asked no questions. The inspector went to view the gardener's shed. Miss Marple followed, her shawl drawn close. The air smelled of wet rope and oil. Inside, the tools were hung in precise order. Only one hook was empty. It bore the label spade. The spade itself leaned outside, newly washed. Seventh clue or observation rested in the wash bucket. The water was clear at first glance, but at the bottom lay a thread of green tape, softened and torn. Miss Marple lifted it with a knitting needle and placed it on a cloth. The inspector exhaled through his teeth. He said it might mean guilt or fear or both. She said sometimes they are the same thing. They returned to the house. The vicar's prayer drifted through the hall like a low wind. Harold stood near the stair rail, his face white. He said he had heard the news and wished to offer sympathy. The inspector thanked him without warmth. Miss Marple looked at his shoes. They were still damp, but the mud had dried in streaks. It was the same pale grit from the wall. Eighth clue, or observation, showed itself when he leaned against the rail. A scrap of paper slipped from his sleeve. She caught it before it fell. It bore only 2 words, written in hurried ink. Ledger, hidden. She returned it without remark. He looked startled, then grateful. She smiled gently, as if she had simply saved him embarrassment. Lady Grenville re-entered, her composure restored by effort. She said arrangements for the coroner had been made. She said she hoped the matter would not disgrace the house. Miss Marple looked at her with quiet kindness. She said truth does not disgrace anyone, though it may rearrange the furniture. The inspector reported that the wall showed signs of recent tampering. The mortar in one section was still soft. He believed something had been hidden or removed. He would return tomorrow to open it. Lady Grenville agreed. Her tone made the agreement sound like surrender. 9th clue, or observation, came from the constable's note. He had found footprints near the gate. 2 sets, one smaller and lighter than the other. One turned back toward the house. The other disappeared toward the lane. Miss Marple thought for a moment. She said 2 people had met at the wall last night. Only one had left the garden alive. The inspector asked whom she suspected. She said she had never liked the word suspect. She preferred to think in terms of sorrow and opportunity. Evening came softly, carrying no colour but plenty of weight. The house lights burned low. The constable kept watch by the gate. Miss Marple sat with her tea, looking at the map again. She tapped her finger on the eastern line and said almost to herself, "Here lies the reason, not the act." Lady Grenville asked if peace would return. Miss Marple said, "Peace never leaves. It only waits for people to become quiet enough to hear it again." 10th clue, or observation, waited outside in the dusk. A thin trail of white mortar led from the wall to the shed. Each step was faint, but together they told a story of careful labour in the dark. Miss Marple saw it from the window and said nothing. She watched as a lantern flickered near the garden's edge and went out. The night accepted it, as the earth accepts every confession in time. She folded her hands and looked toward the stars. Somewhere beyond the clouds, order remained. She believed in order, even when it hid under ivy and pride. Tomorrow, she thought, the wall would open its mouth and tell what it knew. She closed her knitting bag and rose. The inspector thanked her for her insight. She said she had only observed what the garden whispered to anyone who listened. The door closed gently behind her. The path was damp but familiar. The scent of rain was clean again. She turned once to look back. The house stood still, its windows dimmed. Somewhere inside, guilt was making tea with fear. Miss Marple smiled a little. Gardens, she knew, always bloom again, but never quite the same. Chapter 6. The ledger's secret morning laid a pale cloth over St. Mary Mead. The sky kept its colour. The hedges breathed damp air. The east wall waited without comment. Inspector Cray returned, with a mason and a constable. They carried tools wrapped in sacking. They spoke softly, as if the wall might overhear. Lady Grenville met them at the terrace. Her face showed resolve more than rest. She asked whether the house should be cleared. The inspector said no. Miss Marple joined them with her small bag. She wore a neat hat and steady expression. She greeted the mason as if he were a neighbour. Harold appeared on the steps. He looked composed, yet chalky. He asked if this disturbance was necessary. The inspector answered that necessity had chosen the hour. Mr. Dawes stood by the tool-shed door. He kept his hands folded. His eyes measured the ivy as if it were a ledger. The mason examined the mortar near the lower stones. He tapped gently with a wooden mallet. A difference in sound emerged, soft and hollow. Lady Grenville looked away from that sound. She asked Miss Marple to walk a little with her. Miss Marple agreed and moved a few paces aside. They paused near the sundial. The key found yesterday lay in a drawer now. Lady Grenville said it belonged to the old cabinet. She said the cabinet no longer existed. Miss Marple asked who had burned the cabinet. Lady Grenville said she had ordered it done during a season of tidying. She did not meet Miss Marple's eyes. Inspector Cray signalled the mason. The ivy was lifted carefully and laid aside like wet lace. The stones beneath were cool and patient. First clue or observation came from the ivy itself. A bright brass tack lay among the stems. Its head was unmarked. It had not slept long in weather. The mason brushed mortar dust from a narrow seam. He murmured to himself and began to chip. The chips fell with respectful rhythm. The wall answered softly. Harold paced the gravel. He counted under his breath. He said improvements could not be delayed forever. He did not look at the inspector while speaking. Mr. Dawes fetched a pail of water. He set it down near the mason, then retreated. His boots left faint white prints where the dust kissed leather. Miss Marple watched the prints fade. She noted the even stride and the pause at one place only. She marked the pause with her eye and kept silent. The seam gave. The inner stone shifted. The mason eased it forward, then set it on a cloth. Darkness pooled in the little cavity. The constable held a lantern. The inspector looked in without bending. He saw a small tin box, painted green, bound with frayed twine. Lady Grenville drew a breath and let it go slowly. Her hands folded until the knuckles shone. She did not speak. The inspector lifted the box. He weighed it. He asked who would like to witness the opening in the library. Miss Marple said that would be kind. They walked back across the lawn. The house gathered them into cool rooms and measured light. Footsteps sounded discreet and final. In the library, the inspector set the box on a blotter. The vicar arrived summoned by a message. He took a quiet chair and placed his hat on his knees. Mr. Dawes stood just inside the door. He asked if his presence offended. Lady Grenville said no. She wished him to remain. The inspector cut the twine with his pocket-knife. The knot had been tightened recently. The fibres sprang as if relieved. Second clue or observation lived in the knife's smear. A faint line of green wax clung to the blade. The smell was familiar, sweet and sharp. Inside lay paper wrapped in brown tissue. The paper had absorbed the tin smell. Moisture had not reached the centre. Care had done its work. The inspector unfolded the tissue. A ledger, smaller than expected, appeared. The binding was cracked but sound. A leather label read, East Accounts, in faded ink. Miss Marple leaned closer, without touching. She saw thumb shadows on certain pages. Habit leaves marks deeper than law. Lady Grenville closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, her gaze was clear. She asked the inspector to proceed. He placed the ledger on a stand. He turned a page with a handkerchief. Columns stood in patient lines. Names marched with land and numbers. Harold came nearer, then stopped. He stood at the edge of the carpet as if it were shoreline. His breath shortened and then steadied. The vicar folded his hands and waited. Prayer sometimes looks like attention. He was gifted in both skills. The inspector turned to an entry dated 7 years ago. The ink was neat and even. The signature below was the late Lord Grenville's hand. Miss Marple studied the signature. She remembered the ring painted in the portrait. The painter had loved a small scratch near the band. She said the scratch appeared here too, within the loop of the G. The inspector looked, then nodded. Habit is persistent. He turned to a later entry. The columns recorded a transfer to the adjoining property. The sum was small. The note said correction. Third clue or observation waited beside that note. A faint erasure cloud softened the original date. The corrected date aligned with last year. Lady Grenville compressed her lips. She said the date had always troubled her. She had believed the matter finished years before. The inspector turned another page. The handwriting changed for one entry only. It was a careful mimic of Lord Grenville's script, yet not entirely honest. Miss Marple named the difference gently. The crossbar on the T narrowed late. The flourish on the E lost courage at its end. Harold stared as if at weather. He asked whether that entry had legal force. The inspector said that would depend on witnesses and intent. Mr. Dawes shifted his weight. The floor answered with a whisper. He kept his gaze on the ledger, not the faces. The The inspector reached the back. A pocket had been glued into the cover. It contained folded papers and a small map. The glue had loosened at the edges. He removed the contents carefully. The folded papers were letters, 2 in the late Lord's hand, 1 in a clerk's neat print. The map marked the eastern wall with a cross. 4th clue or observation lay inside the pocket seam. A single hair, pale grey, caught in the glue. It was short and fine. It had not travelled far. The inspector placed the letters on the blotter. He read the first aloud in simple phrases. It spoke of a mistake discovered after a survey. It requested a correction and expressed regret. The second letter carried a postscript in a different ink. It mentioned a solicitor's visit. It advised that the ledger remain close at hand for reference. The clerk's note confirmed receipt of measurements from Bedford Row. It listed page numbers and a reference to boundary. East, minor, conscience. Miss Marple's eyes moved to Lady Grenville. The lady held herself very still. She asked whether the letters bore dates near her husband's last illness. The inspector said yes. He said the paper watermarks matched those years. He said the clerk's note was later and practical. Harold asked about the mimic entry. His voice sounded careful, like someone turning a fragile cup. The inspector said the hand could be examined. The vicar requested that they pause to breathe. He said truth requires air as well as light. They allowed the air to collect. Miss Marple looked at the small map. The cross sat within a hand's breadth of the recess. She noted the accuracy. She noted the intent. She asked who knew of the recess. Lady Grenville said very few. Her husband and the gardener had made it years ago for tools and small bottles. Mr. Dawes bowed his head. He said the old lord liked hiding places. He said some men enjoy privacy as a sport. The inspector replaced the ledger on the stand. He turned the key of the library cabinet and left it open. He asked that no one touch anything further. Rain threatened, but did not commit. The lawn held its breath. The house made a small sound like a sigh and then was quiet. Miss Marple requested a moment with the clerk's note. The inspector nodded. She studied the numbers marked on its margin. 2 aligned with ledger pages that had been thumbed. She turned to those pages. One showed a transfer description. The other held a small pencil sketch of the wall. The sketch included a tiny rectangle. It was almost playful. 5th clue or observation sat in the gutter between pages. A thread of green tape had frayed there. It matched the tape found in the shed bucket. Lady Grenville asked whether the ledger made the correction binding. The inspector said it made the intention clear. Law would consider the process next. Harold walked to the window. He looked at the wall as if it were a judge. His jaw tightened. He said improvement plans had to wait. The vicar spoke of charity becoming a better pergola than wood. It was a gentle jest. It relieved no one. Mr. Dawes cleared his throat very softly. He asked if he might speak as a servant who had lived near this wall longer than most. The inspector invited him to speak. Mr. Dawes said the late lord had thought better of many things near the end. He said the old man had wished peace more than pride. Miss Marple asked whether Mr. Dawes had ever seen the letters before. He said no. He said he had seen envelopes and had guessed at their weight. The inspector asked whether he had handled the ledger after the lord's death. Mr. Dawes admitted he had dusted the cabinet weekly. He had never opened the book. 6th clue or observation arrived with a box of matches on the mantel. 2 sticks were burned halfway. The phosphorus smell lingered faintly. The box bore the Inns stamp. Miss Marple lifted the ledger again and angled a page to the light. A water stain marked one corner. The stain outlined something that had once lain atop it. Perhaps a key. Perhaps a folded card. Harold turned from the window. He asked if the mimic entry harmed the intention. The inspector said mimicry harms trust before it harms law. Lady Grenville's hand rested on the table. Her fingers trembled once and then were quiet. She asked if the letters could speak for themselves now. The vicar said they could. He offered to read them again in private with her. She thanked him and declined. She wished to hear them only once. Miss Marple asked to compare the ledger signature with a receipt from the house papers. Lady Grenville unlocked a drawer and produced a small file. She placed it on the desk. They examined a receipt for coal. The late lord had signed it himself. The E had a tiny falter at the end. The mimic entry lacked that falter. It ended as if the pen feared discovery. 7th clue or observation lifted from the drawer's lining. A speck of green wax winked near the corner. The same colour had marked a saucer and a knife earlier. The inspector asked who had access to this drawer. Lady Grenville said only herself and her housekeeper. She said the key lived on a hook in her room. Miss Marple remembered the envelope with almond-scented paste. She remembered the mint habit of the house. She placed those notes quietly beside the ledger in her mind. Harold took a seat at last. He looked smaller. He said the stranger had asked for a meeting on the night he died. He admitted he had urged his aunt to refuse. The inspector asked whether he had met the stranger himself. Harold said no. He had seen a figure near the wall and had returned to the house. His voice lost colour at the end. Lady Grenville stood and walked to the hearth. She looked into the quiet grate. She said she had burned a letter yesterday. She regretted the impulse. She regretted many impulses. The vicar rose and stood beside her without speaking. Presence can steady more than counsel. He knew that well. Miss Marple returned to the small map. She traced the cross with a fingertip. She asked whether another recess might exist higher in the wall. Mr. Dawes said there was none that he knew. She asked where the real will was kept after the funeral. Lady Grenville said the solicitor had retained it. She had accepted a certified copy. The inspector wrote the firm's name carefully. 8th clue or observation hid beneath the ledger stand. A flake of mortar fell from the inspector's handkerchief. He must have brushed the wall without noticing. The flake smelled fresh, not ancient. Miss Marple suggested that someone had used the recess for more than storage. She suggested that a paper had entered and left the wall recently. The inspector agreed. Harold looked at his hands. He said he had wanted the pergola to make the garden cheerful. He sounded like a boy defending a broken toy. Lady Grenville turned back to the table. She placed one finger on the mimic entry. Her voice steadied. She asked who had written that line. No one answered. Silence answered first. It said more than most speeches. Mr. Dawes cleared his throat again. He said the hand looked like a decent man trying to be better than his station. He looked at no one while saying this. The inspector asked him directly whether he had written it. Mr. Dawes said no. He said he was not decent enough with pen or deceit. Miss Marple did not watch faces. She watched breath. She listened to how the room held itself. Rooms always know who is afraid. She asked Lady Grenville whether her husband had ever practiced his signature after illness. Lady Grenville said yes. He had done copywork to steady his hand. He had been ashamed of the wobble 9th clue or observation emerged from a blotting page tucked at the back. A faint mirror of the mimic entry showed in reverse. The impression was deep. Someone had pressed too hard on bad conscience. The inspector said they would send the ledger to the county office. He said a handwriting man would visit. He closed the covers gently, as one closes a well-meaning book. The vicar requested that they rest. He reminded them that grief and truth both tire the mind. The room softened at that. Miss Marple asked one last question. She asked where the little tin of sealing wax was kept. Lady Grenville said in her writing desk. She said the green stick had been a gift long ago. They opened the drawer together. The wax lay within, trimmed at the end with a clean knife. The scent rose, sweet and certain. 10th clue or observation sat beside the wax. A small crumb of grit waited under the inkwell. It was wall mortar, whitened by rain. Lady Grenville closed the drawer herself. She stood very straight. She said the house would confess in its own time. She said people must learn to follow. Inspector Cray nodded once. He thanked everyone with quiet gravity. He said he would return to the wall in the morning. Harold asked whether the funeral arrangements for Mr. Colby would be managed with respect. The vicar said yes. He would see to it personally. Mr. Dawes bowed to Lady Grenville and withdrew. His step was slow. His shoulders looked older than yesterday. They moved to the morning room where light was kinder. The ivy wall was just visible through the window. The house looked more like a home and less like an argument. Tea came and went without being tasted. Words did the work instead. The vicar listened with care. Inspector Cray recorded with calm precision. Lady Grenville continued without haste. The day her husband died, he had spoken of the eastern boundary and asked her to trust his judgment. He had asked that Mr. Dawes keep the key. He had asked that peace be the purpose. She had nodded and then forgotten to obey. She had hidden the will in the recess and hoped to delay the world. She had convinced herself that delay helped everyone. Miss Marple said softly that delay helps no one when truth is simple. Delay makes a small stone into a wall. Mr. Dawes added his piece. He had guarded the recess as ordered. He had suspected someone else had visited it before him this week. The tack had not been his. The mortar smears had not matched his careful hand. Sixth clue or observation came from a folded rag in his pocket. He offered it to the inspector. The rag smelled of lime but not of mint or almond. Its pattern of dust told of steady, honest work. Harold faced his aunt. He said he had been foolish with plans. He had wanted a pergola and a view like a boy wants a medal. He had not asked whether a garden could heal without being changed. Lady Grenville took his hand for a moment. The gesture read as apology given and received. The inspector spoke of Mr. Colby. The man had come to complete a task that had been set aside. He had waited by the wall and met a second person there. A quarrel had followed, perhaps brief, perhaps only a startled rush. Seventh clue or observation returned from the doctor's notes. The blow had been delivered from the right and slightly above. The angle matched someone standing on the slight rise near the tool shed stones. Miss Marple looked from the window toward that rise. She measured the garden in her mind and found the line that mattered. She asked who had stepped on that rise last night. Mr. Dawes shook his head. Lady Grenville said she had not gone out. Harold said he had not either. Mrs. Dawes looked at her hands. The housekeeper raised her eyes. She said she had gone to the tool shed to look for oil. She had heard voices and had paused. She had seen two shadows by the wall. She had heard a cry and a fall. She had run toward them and seen no one standing. The inspector asked whether she had touched anything. She said she had lifted ivy and whispered the name of God. She had straightened the cloak edge and fled in fear. Eighth clue or observation lay within her apron pocket. She produced a broken button in silence. It matched the stranger's gloves. She had found it near the wall and held it all night like a prayer. Miss Marple nodded with kindness. She said fear can hold small objects as if they weigh nothing. She thanked the housekeeper for courage now. The inspector asked who had been the second shadow. No one answered because no one knew. Harold took a breath and spoke again. He had seen a smaller figure move toward the lane after the cry. The figure had carried something long. Not a spade. Perhaps a cane. Perhaps the walking stick. The inspector considered the walking stick recovered earlier. The ferrule had chipped mortar. The handle bore a smear of paste. Yet the blow had not been delivered by a narrow edge. The stick and the fact did not marry. Ninth clue or observation arrived from the constable at the door. He brought a small wooden mallet found near the shed stones. Its face was stained dark along one side. The size matched the wound. Inspector Cray weighed it and nodded once. He asked who kept mallets near the shed. Mr. Dawes said he did. He said any hand might borrow one. Miss Marple looked at the mallet and then at the room. She saw exhaustion, not malice. She saw sorrow that wished to move forward. She spoke with calm care. She said Mr. Colby had stood at the wall to deliver order. Someone had approached, anxious and urgent. Voices had crossed. The mallet had risen and fallen once. Fear had carried the night from that moment. Lady Grenville's eyes closed and opened. She asked whether the law must carry everything now. The inspector said the law would carry what belonged to it. He said truth had already done much of the lifting. The vicar offered a prayer that felt like a hand on a bowed head. The room grew less cold. Miss Marple turned the talk toward the will and the boundary. She suggested a public reading at the church hall. She suggested quiet words and clear maps. She suggested charity in the place where pride had stood. Lady Grenville agreed. Her voice gained a thread of warmth. She said she would stand beside the vicar and answer questions. Harold said he would withdraw the pergola plan. He would draft a path that served both gardens. He smiled once without joy and without despair. Mr. Dawes asked whether he should remain in service. His voice held no plea. It held only respect. Lady Grenville said yes. She said trust had been heavy and had bent many backs. She said they would carry it together now. 10th clue or observation rested on the windowsill as if left there by time. A trace of mortar sparkled in the sun. The window had been opened earlier to let out the smell of paste. The day had chosen to keep nothing hidden. Words wound down without strain. Decisions found their places. People chose their next steps with humility. Before noon, the county officer arrived. Statements were taken. The mallet was carried away. The will and ledger followed with proper guardianship. Miss Marple walked with the vicar to the gate. The garden felt lighter. The ivy no longer looked watchful. It looked like ivy again. The vicar thanked her for patience that never pushes and wisdom that never shouts. She smiled and said, "Villages teach such skills to anyone who listens." She returned in the afternoon with a small jar of mint paste. She placed it upon Lady Grenville's desk with a quiet smile. "Mint," she said, "belongs here." Lady Grenville laughed softly for the first time in days. She thanked Miss Marple and sat down to write letters. She began with an apology to the adjoining owner. Harold brought in a new map and a clean ruler. He asked the gardener to walk the boundary with him when the officer returned. Mr. Dawes agreed with relief. That looked like sunlight. The inspector took his leave near dusk. He shook Miss Marple's hand with respect. He said the garden would speak kindly now. She said gardens always prefer kindness when people let them. Evening deepened. Lamps bloomed in windows. The wall stood simply as a line of stones that kept in roses and kept out strays. Miss Marple paused on the lane. A cat slipped through a hedge and decided nothing required pursuit. The village held its breath and then released it. She reached home and set the basket aside. She wrote a single sentence on a card. Peace does not arrive as a guest. Peace returns as a resident. She slipped the card into her book of household hints and folded her hands. The kettle began to sing, and the day answered with quiet content. And so, dear listener, our story drifts onward. Shall we turn the page to the next chapter? And so, dear listener, Death over the garden wall, a Miss Marple mystery draws to its quiet close. The candle's flame is steady once more, its light falling softly on truth revealed. In St. Mary Mead, peace returns, and Miss Marple's knitting resumes, each stitch a reflection on the tangled hearts of humankind. Until next time, dear listener, another secret fades by candlelight.